Older woman, younger man. That's wonderful news, said Paul when Laura told him of her latest love, and he invited both sisters out to dinner. He was enormously happy that two people he liked so much loved each other, and he ordered 2 bottles of an exceptionally expensive wine. You'll come in contact with one of the most important families in France, he said to Laura. Do you have any idea who Bernard's father is? Laura said, of course, he's a deputy. Paul said, you don't know a thing. Deputy Bertrand is the son of Deputy Arthur Bertrand. Arthur was very proud of his family's name and wanted his son to make it even more famous. He pondered what name to select for him, and then he hit on the brilliant idea of christening him Bertrand. Nobody would be able to overlook or forget such a double name. Just pronouncing Bertrand makes it sound like an ovation, like a call to fame. Bertrand. With these words, Paul lifted his glass as if he were hailing a beloved leader and drinking a toast to him. And then he really took a sip. That's excellent wine, he said, and continued. All of us are mysteriously affected by our names, and Bertrand, who kept hearing it intoned several times a day, lived his life as if oppressed by the imaginary fame of those 4 melodious syllables. When he failed his final school exams, he took it much worse than his school friends. It was as if the double name automatically doubled his sense of responsibility. Thanks to his exceptional modesty, he was capable of bearing the shame that fell upon him, but he was unable to come to terms with the shame that fell upon his name. At the age of 20, he swore in the name of his name that he would consecrate his whole life to the fight for good. He soon learned, however, that it wasn't so easy to distinguish what is good from what is evil. For example, his father voted with the majority of Parliament to ratify the Munich Agreement. He wanted to save the peace because peace is undeniably good, but then it was pointed out that the Munich Agreement opened the door to war, which is undeniably evil. The son wanted to avoid his father's mistakes and therefore clung only to the most basic certainties. He never expressed his opinion about Palestinians, Israelis, the October Revolution, or Fidel Castro, or even about terrorists, because he knew there existed a border beyond which murder is no longer murder but heroism, and that he would never be able to recognize just where that border lay. So he spoke all the more passionately against Hitler, Nazism, gas chambers, and in a certain sense he regretted Hitler's disappearance and the ruins of his bunker, because ever since then good and evil have become unbearably relative. That's why he tried to concentrate on the good in its most direct form, undistorted by politics. His slogan was, life is good. And so the struggle against abortion, against euthanasia, and against suicide became the purpose of his life. Laura protested, laughing. You make him sound like a fool. You see, Paul said to Agnes, Laura is already taking her lover's side. That's very praiseworthy. Just like this wine, for the choice of which you ought to applaud me. In a recent program against euthanasia, Bertrand had himself filmed at the bedside of a patient who couldn't move, whose tongue had been amputated, who was blind and suffered constant pain. The camera showed Bertrand leaning over the bed and speaking to the patient of hope for the future. Just as he said the word hope for the 3rd time, the patient suddenly became excited and started to make a horrible animal sound. The sound of a bull, a horse, an elephant, or all 3 together. Bertrand was frightened. He was unable to continue talking. He tried, with the greatest of effort, to keep a smile on his face. And the camera kept on filming that petrified smile of a terror-stricken, trembling deputy. And next to him, in the same frame, the face of the screaming patient. But I don't want to talk about that. I only wanted to say that he ruined things for his son when he chose his name. First, he wanted him to have the same name as he himself, but then he realized it would be grotesque to have 2 Bertrands in the world. Because people would wonder whether these are 2 persons or 4. Yet he didn't want to give up the joy of hearing in his son's name an echo of his own, and so he got the idea of calling him Bernard. The trouble is that Bernard Bertrand does not sound like an ovation or a call to fame, but like a slip of the tongue, or even more like a phonetic exercise for actors or radio announcers to train them to speak faster and more distinctly. As I said, our names mysteriously influence us, and even in his crib, Bernard was already predestined by his name to speak on the airwaves. Paul was mouthing all this nonsense only because he didn't dare say the main thing on his mind. The fact that Laura was 8 years older than Bernard thrilled him. For Paul had some wonderful memories of a woman 15 years older than himself, whom he knew intimately when he was about 25. He wanted to talk about it. He wanted to explain to Laura that every man's life ought to include a love affair with an older woman, and that this provided men with some of their most beautiful memories. Quote, "An older woman is a jewel in the life of a man," end of quote. He felt like proclaiming, lifting his glass high. But he kept himself from making this rash gesture and contented himself with quiet memories of his former lover, who used to give him the key to her apartment so that he could go there whenever he wanted and do whatever he wanted. This was very convenient at that time, for he was angry with his father and longed to be away from home as much as possible. She never claimed a right to his evenings. When he was free, he spent them with her. When he was not free, he didn't have to explain anything to her. She never urged him to take her out, and when they were seen together in society, she behaved like a loving aunt doting on her handsome nephew. When he got married, she sent him a lavish wedding present, which always remained a mystery to Agnes. But it would have hardly been possible to say to Laura, "I am happy that my friend loves an older, experienced woman who will treat him as a loving aunt treats a handsome nephew." Besides, before he had a chance to say anything, Laura herself spoke up. Quote, "The most wonderful thing about it is that he makes me feel 10 years younger. Thanks to him, I crossed out 10 or 15 bad years. I feel as if I had just returned to Paris from Switzerland and met him." This admission made it impossible for Paul to reminisce aloud about the jewel of his life, and so he reminisced silently, sipped his wine, and stopped taking in what Laura was saying. It was only a while later, in order to rejoin the conversation, that he asked, "What did Bernard tell you about his father?" "Nothing," Laura said. "I can assure you that his father is not a subject of our conversations. I understand he comes from an important family, but you know what I think about important families." "Aren't you curious?" "No," Laura laughed merrily. "You should be. Bertrand is Bernard Bertrand's biggest problem." "I doubt it," said Laura, convinced that Bernard's biggest problem was now Laura herself. "Do you know that old Bertrand was planning a political career for Bernard?" asked Paul. "No," Laura said, shrugging her shoulders. "In that family, a political career is inherited, like a mansion. Bertrand counted on his son someday running for Parliament in his place. But Bernard was 20 years old when he heard the following sentence on a news program. Quote, "The plane crash over the Atlantic claimed 139 lives, including 7 children and 4 journalists." End of quote. We have long become used to the idea that in such reports, children tend to be singled out as a special, exceptionally valuable type of humanity. But on this occasion, the announcer included journalists among them, and Bernard suddenly saw the light. He saw that in our time, politicians cut a ridiculous figure, and he decided to become a journalist. By coincidence, I happened to be teaching a seminar at the law school he attended. There, the betrayal of his political career and the betrayal of his father were completed. Perhaps Bernard has already told you about it? Yes, said Laura. He worships you. Beep boop. Yes, said Laura, he worships you. At that point, a black man entered with a basket of flowers. Laura waved at him. The man showed his beautiful white teeth. And Laura picked a bunch of 5 half-faded carnations from his basket. She handed them to Paul. All my happiness I owe to you. Paul reached in the basket and pulled out another bunch of carnations. You are the one we are celebrating, not me. And he handed the flowers to Laura. Yes, today we are celebrating Laura, said Agnes. And she took a third bunch of carnations from the basket. Laura's eyes were moist. She said, I feel so good with you, and rose to her feet. She pressed both bouquets to her breast, standing next to the black man who bore himself like a king. All black men resemble kings. This one looked like Othello before he'd grown jealous of Desdemona. While Laura looked like Desdemona in love with her king, Paul knew what would happen next. When Laura was drunk, she would always start singing. The yearning to sing came from deep inside her body and rose into her throat with such intensity that several men at adjoining tables turned to look at her with surprise. Laura, Paul whispered, they won't appreciate your Mahler in this restaurant. Isn't that hilarious that she's going to sing Mahler and that's what's playing on the classical station right now? It's awesome. That's fucking awesome. So Mahler's Symphony No. 1 is playing right now. And Laura just happens to be singing Mahler. Laura, Paul whispered, they won't appreciate your Mahler in this restaurant. Laura held a bouquet against each breast as if she were standing on stage. Under her fingertips, she felt her breasts, whose glands seemed to be filled with musical notes. But for her, Paul's wish was always a command. She obeyed him and only sighed, I have an enormous urge to do something. At that moment, the black man, led by the delicate instinct of kings, took the last 2 bunches of crumpled carnations from the bottom of the basket and with a noble gesture, handed them to her. Laura said to Agnes, Agnes, my dear Agnes, without you I'd never have come to Paris. Without you I wouldn't have met Paul. Without Paul I wouldn't have met Bernard. And she placed all 4 bouquets before Agnes on the table. The 11th Commandment. At one time, journalistic fame was symbolized by the great name of Ernest Hemingway. His whole work, his concise, matter-of-fact style was rooted in the dispatches he sent to the Kansas City newspapers as a young man. Bum, 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 bum. Bum, 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 bum. Shagga digga bagga digga wagga digga wah. At one time, journalistic... I gotta turn this up a little bit. This part's really... In those days, being a journalist meant getting closer to reality than anyone else, exploring all its hidden crannies, getting one's hands grimy with it. Hemingway was so proud that his books were so close to the earth and yet reached so high in the heaven of art. But when Bernard pronounces the word journalist to himself, and in France nowadays that word also includes radio and TV editors and even press photographers, he is not thinking of Hemingway. And the literary form in which he longs to excel is not reportage. Rather, he dreams of publishing editorials in some influential weekly that would make his father's colleagues tremble. Or interviews. Anyway, who is the most memorable journalist of recent times? Not Hemingway, who wrote of his experiences in the trenches. Not Orwell, who spent a year of his life with the Parisian poor. Not Egon Erwin Kish, the expert on Prague prostitutes. But Oriana Fallaci, who in the years 1969 to 1972 published in the Italian journal Europeo a series of interviews with the most famous politicians of the time. Those interviews were more than mere conversations. They were duels. Before the powerful politicians realized that they were fighting under unequal conditions, she was allowed to ask questions, but they were not. They were already rolling on the floor of the ring, KO'd. Those duels were a sign of the times. The situation had changed. Journalists realized that posing questions was not merely a practical working method for the reporter modestly gathering information with notebook and pencil in hand. It was a means of exerting power. The journalist is not merely the one who asks questions, but the one who has a sacred right to ask anyone about anything. But don't we all have that right? And is a question not a bridge of understanding, reaching out from one human being to another? Perhaps. I will therefore make my statement more precise. The power of the journalist is not based on his right to ask, but on his right to demand an answer. All right, here's the best part. Wait. Thought it was going to turn into Farajaka. Oh, it's coming up. Please note carefully that Moses did not include among God's 10 commandments, thou shalt not lie. That's no accident, because the one who says don't lie has first to say answer, and God did not give anyone the right to demand an answer from others. Don't lie, tell the truth, are words we must never say to another person insofar as we consider him our equal. Perhaps only God has that right, but he has no reason to resort to it since he knows everything and does not need our answers. The inequality between one who gives orders and one who must obey is not as radical as that between one who has a right to demand an answer and one who has the duty to answer. That is why the right to demand answers has, since time immemorial, only been accorded in exceptional circumstances. For example, to a judge inquiring into a crime. In our century, fascist and communist states have appropriated this right, not only in exceptional circumstances, but permanently. The citizens of these countries have known that at any time there might come a moment when they would be called on to answer what they did yesterday, what they think deep in their hearts, what they talk about when they get together with A, and if they have an intimate relationship with B. It was precisely this sanctified imperative, tell the truth, this 11th commandment, whose force they were unable to withstand, that turned them into a throng of infantilized wretches. Occasionally, of course, some C could be found who would steadfastly refuse to reveal what E and A had talked about, and as an act of rebellion, it was often the only possible way of rebelling, he would lie instead of telling the truth. But the police were aware of this and secretly installed listening devices in his apartment. The police did not do so from any disreputable motives, but only to arrive at the truth that the liar C was concealing. They merely insisted on their right to demand an answer. In democratic countries, anyone can thumb his nose at a policeman who dares to ask what he talked about with A or whether he has intimate contact with B. Nevertheless, even here, the authority of the 11th commandment is in full force. After all, people do need some commandment to rule over them in our century, when God's 10 have been virtually forgotten. The whole moral structure of our time rests on the 11th commandment. And the journalist came to realize that thanks to a mysterious provision of history, he is to become its administrator, gaining a power undreamed of by a Hemingway or an Orwell. All right, here we go. Here's Frère Jacques. Here's Frère Jacques. The whole genius of it is that Frère Jacques, the melody of Frère Jacques is placed in a minor key. They claim that Mahler, when he was very young, saw either one of the people that was a servant in his house, or someone have sex with another servant, and he was a little kid and he didn't understand, and he heard the sounds of the female grunting and groaning, and he thought, of course, that she was in pain, and so he ran over to the male figure and pushed them away, and then of course the female figure chastised Mahler for pushing the male because she was enjoying herself. And then Mahler ran out into the street and he saw an organ grinder and playing really happy music, and here he was weeping inconsolably, and yet he heard this happy music. So this is this concept of this mix of something like Frère Jacques with a disturbing minor key. This phenomenon became unmistakably clear when the American journalists Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward uncovered the sordid dealings of President Nixon during his election campaign, forcing the planet's most powerful man to lie in public, then to admit publicly that he had lied, and finally to leave the White House with bowed head. We all applauded because justice had been done. Paul applauded all the more because he regarded this episode as a sign of a great historic transition, a milestone. An unforgettable moment, the changing of the guard. A new power had appeared, the only one capable of toppling the former professional power brokers, until then the politicians. Toppling them from their throne not by means of arms or intrigues, but by the mere force of questioning. Tell the truth, says the journalist, and of course we may ask just what the word truth means to the administrator of the 11th commandment. To prevent misunderstanding, we stress that it is not a question of God's truth, for which Jean Hus died at the stake, nor a question of the truth of science and free thought, for which they burned Giordano Bruno. The truth elicited by the 11th commandment is not connected with religion or philosophy. It is truth of the lowest ontological story, a purely positivist, factual truth. What did C do yesterday? What is he really thinking deep in his heart? What does he talk about when he gets together with A? And does he have intimate contact with B? Nevertheless, even though it is on the lowest ontological story, it is the truth of our time and contains the same explosive force as did the truth of Hus or Giordano Bruno. Did you have intimate contact with B? Asks the journalist. C lies and insists that he doesn't know B, but the journalist laughs up his sleeve, for the photographer on his newspaper has already secretly snapped B naked in the arms of C, and it is entirely up to him when the scandalous photos will be made public, along with quotes from C, the cowardly liar impudently denying that he ever knew B. The election campaign is on. The politician jumps from plane to helicopter. From helicopter to car, exerts himself, perspires, bolts his lunch on the run, shouts into microphones, makes 2-hour speeches, but in the end it will depend on Bernstein or Woodward which of the 50,000 sentences that he uttered will be released to the newspapers or quoted on the radio. God, he's so ahead of his time. That's why the politician would prefer to address the radio or TV audience directly, but this can only be accomplished through the mediation of an Oriana fallacy, who sets the media rules and asks the questions. The politician will want to exploit the moment when he is finally seen by the entire nation, and to say everything that's on his mind, but Woodward will ask him only about things that aren't on the politician's mind at all and that he has no desire to talk about. He will thus find himself in the classic situation of a schoolboy called to the blackboard and will try to use the old schoolboy trick. He will pretend to be answering the question, but in reality will use the material he has specially prepared at home for the broadcast. This trick may have worked on his teachers, but it does not work on Bernstein, who keeps reminding him mercilessly, "You haven't answered my question." Who would want to be a politician these days? Who would want to spend his whole life being tested at the blackboard? Certainly not the son of Deputy Bertrand.